In 1964, a tiny British family car lined up against thumping American V8 engines, factory Mercedes, and works Citroëns on the hardest rally on Earth. On paper, it had no business finishing, let alone winning. Then it won. And it kept winning. By 1966, 3 of these little cars crossed the line first, second, and third on French soil, humiliating every giant in the sport. Then the organisers took it all away over a set of light bulbs. This is the Mini Cooper at Monte Carlo, the giant killer that got robbed. Number 10. The car that was never supposed to race. The Mini was born out of a fuel crisis. In the late 1950s, petrol shortages had Britain rationing fuel again, and the bosses at the British Motor Corporation wanted something small, cheap, and frugal that ordinary families could actually afford to run. They handed the job to an engineer named Alec Isigonis, and what he came back with was unlike anything on the road. He turned the engine sideways, tucked a wheel into each corner, and freed up so much cabin space that a car barely 10 feet long could seat 4 adults. It launched in 1959 as basic transport. Tiny wheels, a tiny engine, and a price tag aimed at people who had never owned a new car in their lives. Nobody looked at it and saw a race winner. They saw a shopping trolley with a roof. And that is exactly why what came next was so hard for the establishment to swallow. The same things that made it brilliant in a city, the lightweight, the grip from having a wheel at each corner, the way it changed direction like nothing else, turned out to be exactly what you needed when the road was covered in ice. The little economy car had a secret. It just took the right man to notice it. Number 9. One man saw what everyone else missed. That man was John Cooper. By the late 1950s, Cooper was already a giant of motorsport in his own right, a constructor whose little rear-engined cars were in the middle of tearing up Formula One and embarrassing Ferrari. He was also a close friend of Alec Isigonis, and when Cooper got his hands on an early Mini, he felt something the accountants never would. He felt how it cornered. He was convinced that with more grunt under the bonnet, this cheap little saloon could humble cars that cost 10 times as much. The management at the British Motor Corporation thought he had lost his mind. They could not picture their economy car as a competition machine at all, but Cooper kept pushing, and eventually they let him try. The result was the Mini Cooper, and then a sharper version still, the Cooper S Cooper, and his engineers bored the engine out to just over a litre and tuned it to around 90 horsepower. By the standards of the family car it came from, that was a serious jump. By the standards of what it was about to race against, it was almost laughable. 90 horsepower was a fraction of what the front runners were carrying. But Cooper was not trying to win a drag race. He was building a scalpel for the most precise, most punishing test in the sport. And in 1964, he pointed it straight at Monte Carlo. Number 8. The cruelest event in motorsport. To understand how big this was, you have to understand what the Monte Carlo rally actually was in the 1960s. This was not a quick blast around a circuit. Crews set off from cities scattered right across the continent, places like Glasgow, Lisbon, Athens, Frankfurt, and even Minsk, deep behind the Iron Curtain. From there, they drove thousands of miles through the dead of winter just to converge on France. And only then did the real competition begin. The final stages climbed into the Maritime Alps at night, on roads sheeted in ice and buried in snow. The most feared of them all was the Col de Turini, a mountain pass with 34 hairpin bends packed into a few miles, sitting at around 1,600 meters of altitude. Drivers tackled it in darkness, exhausted, on tyre technology that would terrify a modern rally driver. One mistake and you were off the side of a mountain. This was an event that chewed up the toughest cars in the world. Most entries never even reached the finish, so the idea that the winner might be a cheap little British shopping car rather than a thundering works machine from Mercedes or Ford seemed absurd to almost everyone watching. The Monte was where reputations were made and engines were destroyed. It was the last place on Earth you would expect a giant killer to come from, which made it the perfect stage for the upset of the decade. Number 7. The giants lined up against it. So who exactly was the Mini up against in 1964? Start with Ford. The Americans had thrown serious resources at the rally, entering a fleet of 8 Ford Falcons, each carrying a big V8 worked over by the famous Holman and Moody team in the United States. These were brutal, fast cars with engines several times the size of the Minis. Then there was Mercedes-Benz with the big and beautifully engineered 300 SE. There were works Citroëns, the strange and clever DS, riding on hydraulics that soaked up rough roads. There were Saabs, including one driven by Erik Karlsson, a man so good on snow they practically wrote his name into the record books. There were Volvos and a Jaguar in the mix too. Every one of them made more power than the Mini, some of them 4 times as much. The man everyone feared most was a Swede named Bo Ljungfelt, who would spend the whole rally hammering his Ford Falcon to the top of the timesheets. On raw speed on a dry, straight road, the Mini could not live with these cars, not even close. Paddy Hopkirk himself did not believe the little Cooper stood a real chance, and that is the picture you need in your head before the next part. A field of expensive, fast, factory-backed machinery from the biggest names in the industry, and one cheeky red box, barely bigger than a fridge, getting ready to make all of them look silly. Number 6. 1964, the win that stunned the world. Hopkirk and his co-driver Henry Liddon set off in a tartan red Mini Cooper S wearing the number 37 and the registration plate 33EJB. A plate that would become one of the most famous in motoring. For most of the rally, it looked like the form book was right. Bo Ljungfelt and his Falcon were quickest on the stages, and going into the final night, the Ford held a lead of around 65 seconds. On most events, that would be the end of the story. But the Monte ran on a handicap formula designed to even out the differences between big engines and small ones, and the bigger your engine, the faster you were forced to go to avoid penalties. That played straight into the Mini's hands. On the brutal final climbs, on ice where agility mattered far more than brute force, Hopkirk reeled the gap in. He crossed the line of the decisive stage only 17 seconds behind the Falcon on the road, and once the handicap was applied, the little Cooper had done the impossible. It led overall. Hopkirk held his nerve through a final blast around the streets of Monaco and took the win outright. Back home, Britain went wild. Hopkirk got a congratulatory telegram from the Prime Minister and a signed photograph from the Beatles. Overnight, a cheap economy car became a national hero, and the giants of the rally world had just been beaten by a shopping car. And as far as the establishment was concerned, this was meant to be a one-off. It was not. Number 5, 1965, the greatest drive nobody talks about. If 1964 was the shock, 1965 was the statement. This time the Mini was driven by a Finn named Timo Mäkinen, alongside his co-driver Paul Easter. And the weather that year was even worse, a relentless, blinding assault of snow that wiped out most of the field. Conditions were so bad that only a handful of crews could keep anything like a competitive pace. Mäkinen simply ignored it. He drove the little Cooper S through the storm as if the road were dry, winning 5 of the 6 special stages on the final leg, and finishing with a margin so large it barely looked real. The man who ran the BMC competition's team, Stuart Turner, would later call it the finest rally performance of the entire 20th century. Think about what that means. Out of every drive, in every rally, across 100 years of the sport, a man in a tiny British economy car produced the one they still measure the others against. 1964 could be written off by the doubters as a fluke, a quirk of the handicap system, a lucky night. 1965 killed that excuse stone dead. The Mini was not winning by accident. It was now, officially, the car to beat at the hardest rally on Earth. And that was exactly the problem. Because when a small foreign car keeps beating the home favourites on home soil, certain people start looking for a way to make it stop. If you are enjoying this one, do me a quick favour and hit subscribe. This channel digs into the underdog stories that the history books tend to skip over, and there is a lot more where this came from. Right, back to it, because this is where the story turns dark. Number 4. How a shopping car actually beat the V8 engines. It is worth stopping to ask the obvious question: how? How does a car with little more than a litre under the bonnet and around 90 horsepower beat machinery making 3 times and 4 times as much? The answer is that Monte Carlo was never really a power contest. It was a grip and control contest, run on the worst surfaces imaginable. The Mini was light, so it did not bully its tyres or sink into the snow. It was tiny, so it could thread through gaps and hairpins that left the big cars wrestling for room. It drove its front wheels, which gave it traction and stability on ice that the rear-wheel drive giants could only dream about. And it changed direction instantly, where a heavy Falcon needed a postcode to turn around. Then add the human side. The BMC team under Stuart Turner was ruthlessly professional. They sent scouts out to drive the stages just before the cars, noting every patch of ice and every danger, and feeding that information to the crews. That kind of organisation was years ahead of its rivals. So the Mini did not beat the giants by being stronger. It beat them by being smarter, lighter, and better prepared, by turning every weakness on paper into an advantage on the road. The big cars had the muscle, the Mini had the brains. And on a frozen mountain at midnight, brains won. Which brings us to the year it all came to a head. Number 3, 1966, the clean sweep. By now, the French organisers had a problem and they tried to engineer their way out of it. For 1966, the rules were rewritten to favour standard showroom cars, a move widely seen as an attempt to clip the Mini's wings. The British did not flinch. BMC built the thousands of road cars needed to make their rally Minis legal under the new rules and turned up anyway. What happened next was the stuff of legend. Mäkinen, Rauno, Aaltonen and Paddy Hopkirk drove their 3 little Coopers to the front and stayed there. When the dust settled on the final night, after the Col de Turini had done its worst, the Minis sat first, second and third. A clean sweep of the podium. Behind them in fourth came a young Roger Clark in a Ford Cortina. 3 British economy cars had just locked out the top 3 places of the most prestigious rally in the world, on French soil, in front of a French crowd, beating everything France, Germany, Sweden and America could throw at them. It was the single most dominant result the Mini ever produced. The little car had not just won. It had embarrassed the entire establishment, completely in public, with no argument possible. The crowd loved it. The organisers did not. And somewhere in the timing tower, a decision was already taking shape that would turn the greatest day in Mini history into the most notorious scandal in the sport. Hold on to that feeling of triumph, because what they did next still makes people angry 60 years later. Number 2, the trap that was waiting. Here is the part that turns a great racing story into something uglier. Long before the 1966 rally even started, there were dark mutterings that the people running the event did not want to see a 3rd straight Mini victory and would seize on anything to stop it. When the Mini swept the podium, those people went to work. The race officials ordered a marathon technical inspection after the finish, and it went on for around 8 hours. They pulled the cars apart looking for any reason, however small, to throw the result out. Paddy Hopkirk described it perfectly years later. He said they counted all the teeth on the gears in the gearbox. They took the tyres off the wheels, then weighed the wheels and the tyres separately. They went over every nut and bolt. As Hopkirk put it, it was ridiculous, and at first they could not find anything wrong. Think about that for a second. A team of officials spending the better part of a working day, desperately hunting for a flaw in cars that had just won fair and square in front of the world. This was not normal scrutineering. This was a search for an excuse. And eventually, after hours of digging, they found the thread they had been looking for. It had nothing to do with the engine, the gearbox, or the tyres. It was something almost insultingly trivial. It was the headlights. Number 1, the robbery. After all of that, this was their grand discovery. The works Minis had a set of auxiliary driving lights mounted on the front, and in those extra lamps the cars were running single-filament quartz iodine bulbs rather than the double-filament dipping bulbs fitted to the standard road-going models sold in showrooms. That was the crime. Different bulbs in the spotlights. It is hard to overstate how flimsy this was. The lights gave no speed advantage whatsoever. They had been on the cars at the start, and the scrutineers had waved them through before the rally began. BMC had fitted them believing they were perfectly legal. As Hopkirk said, it was technically against the letter of the rule, but it did not help them win the rally one bit. None of that mattered. The officials disqualified all 3 Minis. They also threw out Roger Clark's 4th-placed Cortina for the same reason, along with several other cars. In one stroke, the entire British effort was wiped off the results, and the victory was handed to a Citroën that had finished well behind the Minis on the road, driven by a Finn named Pauli Toivonen. Here is the detail that tells you everything about how wrong this felt. Toivonen was so embarrassed to be handed a win he had not earned on the road that he did not even want the trophy. The crowd knew, the press knew, the whole sport knew. The fastest cars had been beaten in the timing office, not on the mountain. To this day, it is remembered as the most disputed result in the history of rallying, and one of the lowest moments the Monte Carlo rally ever sank to. The Mini had beaten every giant in the sport, so they changed the result over a light bulb. But here is why the story does not end in defeat. The following year, in 1967, the Mini came back to Monte Carlo with something to prove. Rauno Aaltonen partnered with Henry Lydon, the same co-driver who had won the whole thing back in 1964, drove a faultless rally and won it outright by 12 seconds. This time there was nothing to argue about and nothing to inspect away. The win was clean and it was undisputed, and no official could lay a finger on it. The little British economy car had answered the robbery in the only language that mattered, by winning again. And in the end, the disqualification did not shrink the Mini's legend. It made it bigger. Everybody loves a giant killer, but the world falls hard for a giant killer that gets cheated and comes back swinging. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the underdogs who beat the odds and the establishment that tried to stop them, subscribe and stick around. There are plenty more coming.